have these two pretty parallel stories. And some people that I talked to from the BBS side would say, yeah, we knew about ARPANet. This isn't like a secret, but it's not accessible to the everyday folks unless you had a connection. And so some people would have these kind of informal relationships. It's like, basically, I know a guy who gets me an account at the university or something like that. Or you had an account at a job or something and you were able to like access it or carry it on. So there's a lot of informal kinds of connections between them. The real moment of convergence is generally around the early to mid 1990s, which coincides, of course, with like privatization of NSFNet and big components of what we would think of as the internet. And that's a really good reason why we use the word internet to talk about this big mess of communication systems.
Author and educator Kevin Driscoll returns to the Plutopia podcast as we discuss his latest book, The Modem World. We take a nostalgic look back at the early days of online and internet communication, and Kevin explains the impact of early bulletin board systems, news groups, online services, and the coming of the web.
Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of the Plutopia podcast. I'm here with my partner, Scoop, and our guest today is Kevin Driscoll. Kevin is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia, and he joined us not too long ago to talk about his upcoming book. But now we have the book. The book has been published. I have actually read the book. The book is called The Modem World, and I can show it right here for those who can see it. And I know a lot more about the book than I did when we had our last conversation, so we can talk about that. But as kind of an introductory thing, I just want you to hear something here. Some of you may not know that, but that's what the internet used to sound like for most of us. That's how we got on board with a modem.
Deja vu all over again.
So, Kevin, what is a modem?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I've been thinking about that question a lot because there's a simple, well, not so simple, but there's a straightforward technical answer to the question, of course. The modem is the modulator demodulator that lets you take a string of digital signals, pulses, and turn them into something else. The one that we use and talk about all the time is the one that lets you send data as sound over telephone wires made to carry human voices. So it allowed a whole, cohort of people to appropriate the existing telephone network for data communications. And that's the straightforward answer. But the reason it's in the title of the book in part is because during this period of time we've been talking about, the 1980s and 1990s, owning a modem took on some greater cultural meaning. And the thing that I always talk about with folks, and this isn't just for undergrad students, but all kinds of people, is that for a long time, if you bought a computer, there was no communications capability built into it. There wasn't the idea that people buying PCs were buying them to get online or to make networks with each other. That was an add-on, and like not necessarily cheap add-on. Like there's not a ton of data on this, but some of the market research data showed that when people were deciding what to buy for their machines, they would definitely buy like a printer, a second disk drive, hard drive, joystick. Like there's a lot of stuff in line before they got down to modem. So for those people who did buy a modem, you kind of like became a special class of computer owner. And the thing that I came back to a lot was seemingly a simple question, which was like, why did anybody buy a modem who wasn't required to? If your like job or school or something didn't make you get a modem, then what was it that made you get one? I mean, you probably all had this experience. It really isn't till the 90s that the computer makers started to throw a modem in the bundle because they were starting to be like cheap enough in modems that they could throw it in with like a set of speakers and some other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell my own story. I bought a computer because I discovered that such a thing as a modem existed and that you
Uh-huh.
could connect with other computers. And I knew that because I had been for many years reading Whole Earth Catalog and the related publications, Coevolution Quarterly, Whole Earth Review. And they talked about their bulletin board system, the Well. And I thought, shit, I've always wanted to connect with these guys. I haven't made the trip to California, but I could do the next best thing. I could just log on to the Well. So I went to my wife and I said, we need to go get a bank loan and buy a computer and get a modem for it. And she told me, you are out of your fucking mind. Why would we need to do that? But she was a realtor. And I said, if you did that, you could connect to your multiple listing service. So then she had a reason to have a modem. So we both had a reason to have a modem. And that was our whole rationale for buying the computer. But I sense, and I think you have validated that that was often not the case, and people discovered their desire for a modem later, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you kind of need to see someone use it to get why it's interesting at all. So I think a lot of people, it was like looking over the shoulder of a friend or like someone's urging you to check it out. And that's kind of the tone of a lot of the literature that's not in directly in computer magazines. What would be in other places would be these little one-off articles that are like, hey, readers of this magazine, like whatever, record collectors or something, here's why you should be interested in modems, because look what we're doing over here online. If all you need is this modem and you can get into it, and because a lot, sometimes they're speaking to even computer owners, but they're not people who are using the computer to participate the way that you're describing.
And I want to step aside a little bit and just make the point, the important point that your book makes, and that we should use as a frame for this conversation, which is when people think about the internet or talk about it or write books about it, they're often talking about ARPANet, the Defense Department's network and how that evolved. And they'll talk about how the internet kind of started rolling out and started mainstreaming in the 90s and so forth. But you can't really have a history of the internet without including the evolution of bulletin board systems, because the internet that we have today would not be the way it is today if it was not for those BBSs. That was a clear step in the evolution of the BBS.
Yeah, it's a historical.
I mean, of the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it's a historical problem that I thought about a lot in writing the book, which is like, as you move across time and among different groups of people, the meaning of internet changes a lot. And so some groups of people had a very clear idea that like the internet consists of these types of machines using these protocols who are in these sort of institutions. And then other people had a much more expansive, inclusive, we might say, sense of what that was. And I think the reason that we cast about for different terms like cyberspace or the matrix or the net or something like that was because we needed a word that captured all of this online activity that didn't quite fit into any particular bucket. So how do you talk about this like online space that it could include CompuServe and commercial systems and the thing you use for email at work and Usenet and these cooperating like grassroots networks and national networks in Europe? Like there had to be a term for those. And it's funny and like kind of unexpected that we end up using internet as the catch-all term, that everything that connects to it becomes the internet. It kind of like vanishes under that umbrella. So by the end of the 90s, we've like a lot of people lost a sense of there being this like big diverse palette of different networks that were all kind of connected at their borders, and we started to see the whole thing as like one universal system.
John Quarterman used the term matrix for that. When he wrote his book about the matrix, he said the matrix is the internet and all the systems that connect through the internet. So he was including like BBSs who are exchanging email over the internet and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I like his definition a lot, and he's probably one of the few people who sat down and wrote it out. Like, here's how I'm defining it, and here's why I include these systems and not those. And he has a very inclusive definition, because anybody basically who can email someone, he will include as like part of this internet, which I think is pretty sharp, because then it gives you this kind of like it gives you some basic framework for thinking about it. So there's this whole section in the matrix of just how do you send email from system A to system B, and you see the email addresses like stretch as they have to include more and more information to carry them. You can imagine, you kind of imagine like electronic envelopes inside of envelopes, or when you get a package from around the world and it has like 9 different stamps on it and a dent in the corner.
Well, during the age of the modem, the big problem, at least for me, I was on so many different services, is people may not remember that you had to use your landline telephone connection to use that modem. So that meant if you're someone in your household wanted to make a phone call, then that's when the fight broke out. And my wife did that to me, would come in and smack me upside the head, like, I need to make a call. So that was inconvenient, but that was the nature of early modem-based communication.
I remember suggesting to my wife that we get a second telephone line for the modem.
I ended up with 4, and when I got my first DSL connection, it's like, I canceled a bunch of phones. It's like, that's great.
Yeah, I got really curious about the like expansion of phone service and tried to track that. Like, how is the phone company selling the second line? And it was rarely for data, which I thought was kind of a surprise. It would be like, oh, you're a household with 2 teenagers. You got to get a second phone line because those kids are on the phone all the time. Give them their own number. Or you're going to get a fax, or like a dedicated machine that's going to sit on that line. Whereas I expected to see more marketing around like, put your computer on that second line, and then you can talk on the phone while you're on online at the same time. So there,
Well,
yeah.
Well, I was just saying the POTS people, Plano Telephone Service, those companies, they didn't really see the internet. They didn't see it coming. They didn't realize what it was going to be, even though it was going to rely so much on their service.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. Did either of you have ISDN?
I had ISDN once. It was about 2000, 2001. I had moved from Colorado back to Texas and was living in a rural area where I could not get high-speed internet other than through ISDN. And it really didn't work very well. And I was back and forth with the phone company, and they were going to install a repeater to try to improve the signal. But it was really not that great.
Kevin, you mentioned a word that may be indicative of the change that the internet has made to our technology. Do you still have a fax machine? I used to have several. I haven't had a fax machine in years, simply because I could do the same thing over the internet.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just thinking about it a few minutes ago, because I came to the office and went to the mailroom where there's a fax, and it was a bunch of like unsolicited ads sitting in the fax machine. So someone out there is sending at least unsolicited faxes, but I think most fax communications for everyday folks is either through a fax gateway, like some sort of online fax service, or
like eFax.
Yeah, or you just send an attachment to your
I think
email,
that's the most common thing, is to send an attachment now. But fax machines were used as a way to kind of describe network effect.
Yeah.
Where you could say a single fax machine isn't very valuable. If everybody has a fax machine, it's really valuable.
That's true. Yeah, there's some interesting like political history with fax machine campaigning. Kind of infamously, Ross Perot's campaign did a lot with faxes, trying to get the various field offices doing direct, campaign efforts with faxes. But you're right, that's almost like the case of the failure of adoption led to this like alternative view maybe, you know what I'm reminded always of is the second Back to the Future movie where they show people getting faxes like pretty routinely in their homes, which probably seemed like a reasonable guess that we would all have a fax machine, and then just never quite came to fruition.
I guess a fax is just another instance of a modem, right? I mean, basically, you're using a modem signal to transmit data over a line that was set up for voice communications, and
Yeah.
it was almost inevitable that those things would fade. You know, we didn't realize it at the time, and it also speaks to the fact that sort of as you step into the world that we're in now, the internet, you have these steps where you're doing things where you have one foot in the old world. You know, it's like the idea that you have to send a signal that will allow you to paper to print out, you know, with the message on it. And now somebody would send you a PDF and you would just read the PDF on the screen, right?
Yeah, there's a couple of folks who've been writing about histories of technology that are telephonic, and like the telephone telecom story is in the middle, and then ones that are more computer centric. And so you can kind of see the fax as like the telephonic mode, where you're thinking about there's this big network, and then we attach different equipment to the end of it. And some of it's for voice phone calls, and some of it's for like leaving a sound recording, and some of it is for leaving a picture, and that the fax serves that purpose. But yeah, I mean, pretty early in the 90s, you could buy a modem that could talk over like a whole bunch of different protocols and could do faxes and could give you a little bit of a digital answering machine on your PC and do call waiting and caller ID and things like that. So once the chips can, learn different protocols, then they become these like sort of universal telecom machines.
One of the places where I've uncovered a need for a fax machine is in the field of medical information, medical records, contacting a pharmacy about prescriptions. I worked for a long time with Kaiser Permanente's IT group in California, and I had to transmit data not by modem, but by, I don't think they really understood the technology. They said, you have to fax it to them. I'm like, well, it's the same thing. He said, no, you have to fax it because we don't trust those internet connections. It's like, oh, whatever. And it went on for years to where, we had to have analog lines so where we could connect up to this person that we were sending these records to. It's like, I never got the logic, but someone said that it was not secure, so you have to use a fax machine and not a modem.
That's a great example, though. I mean, I don't know anything about what the security is like on fax communications. On some level, it becomes like security through obscurity. But it is interesting. Like once a large institution like healthcare adopts some kind of communication system, it doesn't change fast.
No, it doesn't.
And to people's credit, I think a lot of folks that work in those institutions don't make changes quickly. They are very deliberate about changes that they make, even if it's like frustrating to experience it in the moment.
Yeah, IT management generally is very resistant to change at a certain level. It's way up there, and they're not really having to deal with the actual technology. They're dealing with the policies and the and the bureaucracy. And I actually created a program that would allow this system. It was a tandem system that would take their reports, which were generated on a mainframe, convert it to a web page that would be sent to their local business server where they could just go in with a web browser and read the report. Instead, they had to use like a mainframe-based program that went onto the mainframe and sucked up the report, and they had to, display it locally. It's like, instead of taking like 10 seconds to get your report, it would take like 3 or 4 minutes. So, but that was a management decision that never went away.
Well, the kind of the thing that we were going to talk about today that interests me, I know, and I know it interests you, Kevin, a lot about all this, is how this kind of communication, as it started to evolve, became people talking to people, many to many, and connecting with each other, and actually forming communities. And that's kind of interesting to see that the drive for people to actually hang out together had so much to do with the evolution of the way that we use modem technology early on, and what eventually became the internet. And what you can see, I think, in all of this evolution that's happened, the internet and FidoNet, which was sort of like a different internet that got built, and then the BBS, all the BBS systems that were standalone, pulling a bunch of people together and then wanting to figure out a way to communicate across systems. That's all, like, the impulse there is that people want to find a way to connect with other people and do it online.
Yeah. And I think once you kind of crack it that way, you see a longer trajectory, or a longer prehistory to the modem-based communications. So in the book, I wrote a little bit about CB and amateur radio and some of the like still technological, like technology mediated kinds of gatherings that people had, but through, in those cases, through radio, sometimes in your car, sometimes at home, sometimes you're standing on the top of a mountain. But people seem to adopt the technologies at hand to try to build these kinds of communal spaces for group communication, just like you're describing. And they have been doing that since they got access to movable type. So then it lets you look back at this situation of getting online with computers and say, like, okay, we see some continuity here from things people have been doing for a while. What is unique about this situation? Like, what was special about these particular kinds of systems and the people that were drawn to them?
I was muted, sorry. And one other thing was, there was like there was BBS culture, and then there was early sort of network culture that was coming from the ARPANet side and all of that. And those two sort of converged. And where do we see that convergence starting, really?
Yeah, probably early on. There's, the way I had thought about it is like you have these two pretty parallel stories. And some people that I talked to from the BBS side would say, yeah, we knew about ARPANET. This isn't like a secret, but it's not accessible to the everyday folks unless you had a connection. And so some people would have these kind of informal relationships. It's like, basically, I know a guy who gets me an account at the university, or something like that. Or you had an account at a job or something, and you were able to like access it or carry it on. So there's a lot of informal kinds of connections between them. The real moment of convergence is generally around the early to mid 1990s, which is coincides, of course, with like privatization of NSFNet and big components of what we would think of as the internet. And that's a really good reason why we use the word internet to talk about this big mess of communication systems. But I think looking for those moments of contact is really interesting. Like, there were lots of people, and not lots, there's many people around the ARPANET community who are also interested in PCs and home computers and small networks and telephone-based, networks. So there was a group organizing around ARPANET who wanted to make PC connections, and it didn't really get off the ground before the BBS folks started building their own systems. So you had CBBS in Chicago and ABBS out in California and other BBSs starting to work, that messages are being traded and people are calling in and things like that. Whereas the PC side of the ARPANET story was still kind of hypothetical. And the other kind of like, I guess, key piece to like keep in the back of our minds is that PC world of like home computers, whether it's Apple's or, IBM compatible machines and stuff, really were like in a separate space from the kinds of machines someone would use at a computer lab at their university, or the kind of workstation they might get later at their job or something like that. And so software and techniques didn't necessarily carry over. So it wasn't like you could even get TCP IP for MS-DOS for most of the 1980s. And the kinds of TCP IP software that was available was created by amateurs. In the case of DOS, by folks who were from the amateur radio community who were using it to do over-the-air communications. So even if you knew about ARPANet, and even if you had a friend who could hook you up, you still needed to have this like technical expertise and not necessarily inexpensive equipment to get involved. Whereas
Yeah, I
by
got my
the end of
first.
the 80s, if you were going to a big state university, you might get an email address during your orientation coming into school. So there were these parallel like on-ramps into getting into the space. And then it took some time for you to even figure out that you could send messages or make connections across those borders.
Yeah, I got my first internet connection through Quarterman, and he was teaching me all that stuff. So I was learning some Unix, some very fundamental Unix stuff. And then he was, teaching me this internet stuff. And it's like, well, you can go to the well if that's what you want to do, but you got to remember that the well is not the internet. And there's this whole other world over here that's Usenet that you should consider looking at. And you start looking at Usenet news groups, and you start to realize that, there's a huge thing beginning to form. And I guess one of my questions, I kind of think that on that convergence question, that it was when the BBSs first started realizing that they could exchange mail with something like UUCP over the internet. But how did they figure out how to do that? Where did that come from? Did you, in your research, did you see what the genesis of that kind of sharing was?
Yeah, so the UUCP is almost like a different history because UUCP networks were not necessarily internet networks also. And like the early Usenet history started, as I understand it, from college students who had like summer internship at Bell Labs or something like that, who were trying to keep it going. And they started exchanging messages over UUCP, and that developed into Usenet. And then Usenet, of course, could like be carried on lots of different media. So there are even some remote Usenet sites where they would receive like magnetic tape in the mail and get a whole like month of messages at once. Folks would reply and mail a tape back. I mean, I don't think that was super common, but you can imagine like these messages don't necessarily know what medium they're flowing over. They don't know if they've come from a university site or a telephone call. So the BBS folks, a number of them have access to Usenet, and they're interested in it and talking to each other about Usenet. And the parallels are really clear, like the kinds of things and communities and conversations people are having on Usenet. There are similar conversations happening over on bulletin board system networks. And once FidoNet is becoming pretty reliable and there's messages flowing from board to board among the BBS world, now it really looks like a parallel universe. And so you start to see some gateways and some efforts to write software that will translate the formats of the messages so that a message that originates on a Fido node can be carried on a Usenet server, and likewise messages that originate on Usenet can be carried over onto a Fido server. And at the beginning, as far as I can tell, there's a few folks who start running these gateways at their places of work, and either out of beneficence or benign neglect, like nobody notices that those occasional phone calls are happening to like carry the messages one way or the other. I think at first the gateways weren't two-way. There was messages like coming over from Usenet and you could read them, but you couldn't necessarily reply, or you could send a one-to-one email reply, but you couldn't get your message back up into the news group. And then by the late 80s, seems like there's a number of news groups and then conversely FidoNet echoes that are being mirrored across. Of course, both in FidoNet and in Usenet, the administrators of the nodes can decide whether they want to carry these topics or not. Like very few would carry all of them. They would be selecting them based on the interests of their users or preferences of the admins and things like that.
Yeah, before I was able to get connected to the internet through an ISP, I subscribed to a service. It was like a BBS for independent music producers, which I was doing at the time also, and as part of the deal, which cost me like $100 a month, which was killing me in those in that economy, you got internet access. They had a little portal in there. You could go in and you could go to the news groups or whatever you chose, and of course you were going to be also paying long distance phone charges because they weren't local. But that was the only way that I was able to get internet. And then of course, when ISPs became widespread, then it was a whole different game.
Yeah, I think we're describing a lot of things that have to do with the pre-web experience of getting online, which we can talk about also. But I think another thing for folks who are like newer, or have only been online, I don't know, 25 years or so, the web is just this dominant like interface to being online where anything is like one click from anything else. And you don't really feel yourself like traveling far across these connections. Whereas I think, the idea that you might dial a local number to get into the network and then you could like connect from there over telnet to the well or something like that to get around the long distance call, you were just more sensitive to the feeling that I'm like going from one network to another network, and I'm making this network has these applications and these have these people are over here, and you kind of get this like almost spatial sense of moving. I think the like Quarterman, the book certainly like offers a bunch of maps and ways of imagining these kinds of connections, but everybody had their own way of thinking about it. And part of the BBS, like among people who are building BBSs with internet connections, they often would think of it as like, yeah, the internet is like the highway and we're like the local roads. And so you're going to like get on my system, get up on the highway, get off at your system, do some activities, get back on the highway, come back over here. Like you could imagine this way of thinking about like tiers or kind of like hierarchical networks. But once you have the experience of like clicking around on the web, that eliminates that sense of the hierarchy. Like everything is one click from everything else. So then you don't feel yourself moving across the network as much. How does that resonate with your all experience?
I was just thinking about Quarterman's matrix maps, which became part of he started a little publishing empire there. He was publishing Matrix News through Matrix Internet and Directory Services, or MIDS, and Matrix Maps was an adjunct to that. And actually on the well, we had a private conference for Matrix News, which I hosted for a while, and then Eric Theis took over. So there was a robust flow of information just coming from that one guy who was like, had the truly expansive vision of the internet very early on and really sort of understood what was unraveling there. And it was pretty fascinating to kind of make that connection. I was very fortunate to make that connection in the context of also connecting with the Electronic Frontier Foundation through the well, and connecting with all these other people that I was meeting, not just through the well, but I started meeting people through EFF, and I started meeting people through other connections that I was making just through taking my networking. I was a kind of person who liked to network with people, and I took that online and really just started meeting a lot of people and getting connected with a lot of very interesting projects. But one thing I can remember is that just sort of the sense that there was something was percolating that was very social. It was very much people connecting with people in so many different ways. And, you could be writing for people that you never laid eyes on. You could be exchanging all of these ideas and thoughts. And early on, we didn't really have images, so we had no idea what the people looked like or any of that. And this thing went on for a while and evolved eventually into what today we're calling social media. But it started with people getting a kind of true sense of community with each other. And I would argue that that sense of community has actually been diminished by the move into social media systems, especially when you have something like Facebook or Twitter, where the user is really the product. It's not, we're here to serve the user, we're here to serve the advertiser, and the user is our means to do that. And I think that there's a real desire now to get back to what people had with BBSs and what people had with the well, and just kind of the online community thing. And you can see that you can see a lot in the gamers, and now that gaming has become interactive online experience, I know people who are for hours, they're constantly rummaging around with a whole group of other people distributed all over the place. I remember my grandson telling me once that he had been playing a game kind of all night with this guy who finally had to hang up and go on guard duty because he was like in the Middle East and it was his turn to go to guard duty. So you have this stuff that's happening there. It's not happening in social media, though. It's happening on Discord, or it's happening on Twitch. It's happening in games. I don't know, kind of what observations do you have about that? How do you think about the way that we've evolved to what we have now from what we had then?
Yeah, totally on the same page thinking about this. One of the things that I got hung up on, so if there's one constant problem in this project, which was like, what is the internet, or what does anybody mean when they say internet? The other problem is, who are we talking about? Because for a lot of this time, very few people had access to the internet. I mean, we happen to know a lot of people who had access to the internet, but that's pretty unusual. And so one way to think about this history is like, for the most part, this period of time where internet access is so mainstream that it's just an assumption. Like at, I don't know, a preschool down the street from me here, they're going to assume that every family has email and that they can send out announcements on email about school events and important things that are going on. That's not a backup. That's the primary mode of communication. And I think that period of time is relatively recent, that has been that way. And some of that communication now happens on Facebook groups or WhatsApp or things like that. But that period of time where you assume that almost every adult that you meet has access to email and messaging and the web is maybe like 15 years or so, certainly in the 2000s. And from the demographic data I've seen, home broadband only overtook dial-up as the most common way of accessing the internet from home after 2005. And of course, people don't generally have smartphones with like broadband speed connections, even in big cities, until the 2010s. So now we're getting into the last decade or so. There's no Facebook or these like mainstream kinds of systems until 10 or 15 years ago. So we have this like somewhat recent period of time, which is everybody getting on all at the same time. Some of those people have no prior experience of an internet before Facebook, before YouTube, and before Gmail as like the primary email provider. So they've only ever experienced this internet of platforms and relatively small number of big players. Then there's a much smaller group of people who had an experience of like from 1995 till then, dial up. They know the sound of the modem. They've been on AOL or whatever. Maybe they had to because of work, or maybe they wanted to. And then there's like a much smaller group of people whose experience goes into the 80s and before, who maybe because of like I don't know, they could be a foreign correspondent, they had to modem in their stories or something. So we have like these big jumps in scale in who's getting online. And the social media era coincides with a massive expansion in who can get online. And most of those people are figuring it out as they go. So it's new to them. the whole enterprise of chatting with strangers is new, and they have no prior experience of it. The other kind of like wrinkle of it is we're talking about the 90s as like a convergence of networks and technologies, but that also was a convergence of communities and people. And so some people thought of it as like, wow, like I can finally talk to people from other places who share this interest. It's not just like me and the 10 people who live in my town who are into this stuff, but it's like me and every single other person I can find. And so that's like this proliferation of community growth, which could be interest driven. So it's like everybody who's collecting Brazilian jazz is now in touch with each other and talking about their favorite records and stuff like that. Or people planning trips can like compare notes with other hikers and things like that. So there's a way that that convergence, we should also remember it as like a social phenomenon of like niche groups of people being in touch with each other for the first time. So I think there's a lot of different kind of like, I'm throwing a lot of pieces up in the air to see how complex this is, and that we might have experienced the turn to social media as like an aberration, but a lot of other people have only ever known that. And so part of the importance of like preserving and reciting these kinds of histories and these stories is to let people know like it has been different before, and we don't have to invent things from whole cloth, because Facebook is not the first time that we tried to build community spaces online, and we tried many other ways to do it that had totally different outcomes from what's happening on Facebook. Yeah, I mean, we all have had this experience of being on the well at different times, and the well is, for a big chunk of its history, is not a non-commercial space. So it's not even about commercialization or anti-commercialization. It's what you said, like in the Facebook business model, which is like a very particular way to run an online service. They've done it in a way that runs counter to the goals of a lot of communities that might flourish there.
Well, during COVID, with the shutdown and the need to connect to your work remotely, connect to your school remotely, it was uncovered that we had, especially in Austin, they found there were significant internet deserts that people did not have access. They had to find some way to get access. And so the school district is putting out hotspots just so that students in particularly, communities of color, disadvantaged communities, they can't afford internet, even though most people think, oh, it's just cheap, we can get it for nothing. If you're making minimum wage, it's not on your list of things you can afford. And they've done studies that found, just an incredible disparity in access to the internet, between communities of color, disadvantaged, and upscale communities who just, have it, as a right, I guess.
Well, and to the extent that a lot of people have access, it's through the smartphone that they're carrying, and they manage to get that, and they manage to have their service that allows them to access information services, but you're limited with a smartphone. And, if you're like having to go to your school class and do your schoolwork and so forth and submit it through a smartphone, that's difficult. So it could be that a lot more people have access than have access that is, what's the term? I guess maybe as flexible as the access that some of us have.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the same thing here in Central Virginia of folks not having access, or, it does reveal the big gap between an internet service where you can be really active on a lot of different systems versus one where you are live streaming multiple streams of video at the same time for 8 hours. And those are totally different demands on our infrastructure that we hadn't noticed necessarily. I'm also linking you to a book from one of my colleagues, Chris Ali, who wrote this great book called Farm Fresh Broadband about rural telecom policy and broadband access. And he went and talked to people in lots of different situations who were frustrated or trying to find solutions to this problem, because it's easy to imagine that, like, yeah, as I portrayed it just a few minutes ago, everybody's online being online is not a simple category. Like you can be online in a lot of different ways. And then people get around in really different and clever ways that we don't necessarily see. I'm also thinking of this other researcher, Andres Lambana Bermudez, who was at UT Austin doing this research actually, where he was writing about young people's internet usage, and he showed all these folks where he's like, these kids mostly can get a smartphone for almost free, and they don't have a SIM card in it. But so many businesses around have free Wi-Fi that it's like, you and I can have a conversation where I'm walking by McDonald's and I hop on their free Wi-Fi for a minute and we are chatting, and then I keep walking, I lose my service, and then I'm at Walmart and I get service again, and I can like continue on the conversation. So you can have this mental map of like where free internet access happens. So there's a lot of ways of being online that we might not even consider that are quite different from like just straight up, cable from Comcast or something that comes to your house.
Do you know about the history of free Wi-Fi?
Tell me.
Oh, I've got an interesting story about that.
Yeah.
It may have happened otherwise in other places, but this was one of the first attempts to really spread Wi-Fi was here in Austin. And one thing we did, we were recommending the city that they put in Wi-Fi, which happened, and that's a whole other different story. But there's an entrepreneur, a guy named Rich McKinnon that I've known for years, and he was an early internet adopter who worked for a company called Portal, which was also doing online community stuff. And as Wi-Fi started appearing and started getting some use, and we started thinking about how great it would be if people could have more access to it in more places, Rich had this great idea, which was that, there's a bunch of places where people go to hang out, like coffee shops and so forth, where they would really benefit from having Wi-Fi. It could be like an amenity that they offered. So his idea was that we create an organization that was called Austin Wireless City, and that we have one set of people who go out to these places and pitch them the idea of having a Wi-Fi service that their customers can use. And that those people would, to the extent that they could get people to agree to do that, then they would send another set of people in who would actually install the equipment and get it working, get it all, correct. And that the organization would kind of like help people along, and make sure that it continued to work and so forth. So what happened was that Wi-Fi started popping up in coffee shops and car dealerships, just whatever you could think of. If you thought of a place where Wi-Fi might be a good thing, you'd go in and pitch it to them. If you were, we called them walkers, they would walk around and find places. And pretty soon it went from being Wi-Fi is a great amenity in a coffee shop to being, if you have a coffee shop and you don't have Wi-Fi, then nobody's going to want to come to your place. And that was, I think that was really the genesis of this spread of free Wi-Fi in all kinds of places, and it owes to Rich McKinnon. It was his bright idea to do that, and it worked.
I
it
love
really
the idea
spread
of
in
the
Austin.
walking too.
Yeah.
And it reminded me also, like a funny coda on that is my old neighborhood in LA. There was a coffee shop that advertised no Wi-Fi. So it was like every other coffee shop has Wi-Fi. We're the one where you can come and chat and like hang out and have a conversation with no people on laptops. So it came full circle to where no Wi-Fi was the amenity.
That sounds like a great idea, because a lot of people I know some people who ran coffee shops that kind of got out of the business because they had Wi-Fi squatters. They would set up an office. I mean, they'd come in, buy a cup of coffee and a donut, and then they'd be there for 4, 5, 6 hours. And people that just wanted to come in for coffee couldn't find a seat.
Yeah. This actually raises another question I'm interested in, if I can bounce one out to you both, which is about ways we think about the internet like intersecting into the physical world. And so adding Wi-Fi to a coffee shop is one way to do it. But I definitely experienced some spaces around bulletin boards where it was a pre-existing organization that could be a store or a clubhouse or like some other, after school program where they added a BBS or later some kind of internet service to extend this like in-person community that already existed, which seems to me like an important difference from starting an online community from scratch where you begin in the online space. Something where you have a pre-existing relationship with a bunch of people and then you like extend it online seems like an important model that I don't talk about enough.
I've got a good example of that. SMOF BBS, SMOF being spelled SMOF, and it was an abbreviation for Secret Masters of Fandom.
Yeah.
And what it was, it came out of there's a annual science fiction convention, still happens, but it's been going on for years in Austin called Armadillo Con. And one of the Armadillo Con people, a guy named Earl Cooley, set up this BBS, SMOF BBS, and a bunch of the science fiction people who would go to that conference and who kind of knew each other joined that BBS, and we're on there hanging out. That was the first bulletin board system that I discovered when I got the computer and I got the modem and everything, certain people in my family wouldn't allow me to rack up a bunch of long distance charges by calling the well. So, wow, I'll try some of these local BBSs. And the first one I went to was SMOF, and it turned out to be a great experience. And there was a guy on there who called himself Jules Verne. That turned out to be Bruce Sterling. And that was when he and I became friends. And Mike Godwin, who became counsel for EFF, the first attorney at Electronic Frontier Foundation, was on that system as Johnny Mnemonic. There were a bunch of people on there who have sustained relationships through the years. Earl, unfortunately, died a couple of years ago. And, post BBS, after BBS has kind of started to fade, his BBS went away. But he continued, he was an online presence and an active like Facebook guy. So that was an example of a BBS that was successful, was influential, and came from a community that already existed.
Yeah, that's a great example. And fandom broadly, like science fiction fantasy fandom, seems like an important place where people have been building networks since the beginning, whether it was like fanzines or mailing, like physical mailing lists or other kinds of things.
The Science Fiction Writers of America, SFWA, got connected with Genie. I don't know exactly how it happened, but Genie had a ton of science fiction writers hanging out there.
Yeah, I've actually seen some funny stuff of that where it would be basically a transcript of a roundtable off Genie that then would get reposted on Usenet or FidoNet or other places where fans would gather, and people would talk about it like, oh, I couldn't participate in that because I don't have a Genie account, or they don't have a local dial-in number in my neighborhood or something. But one cool Genie thing that I've thought about a lot is that they published a monthly newsletter for the users, and you could mail in a snapshot of yourself and they'd run a few pictures in the magazine to be like, here are the people you're chatting with. So even though we were thinking about it as like text only space, if you had the magazine, then you kind of got this way of seeing like a profile of the person, the way we would think about profiles like much later on more graphical systems.
Yeah, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. You remember that?
Yeah.
At the time, nobody could see anybody else on the internet. Sorry, go ahead, Scoop.
On those services like Genie, CompuServe, AOL, I found Genie to be particularly nice as far as having a community. And I learned it I learned how good it was during the Loma Prieta earthquake back in 1989. I was living in the Bay Area, and it was severe, and it knocked out a lot of community. Most people didn't have a phone, but for some reason, my neighborhood, I had a dial tone, and I dialed up through I tried CompuServe. They weren't online. Genie was available, and I got on, and there was a group of people forming an ad hoc network to contact people to give them an update on somebody that's in the Bay Area to say we're alive or we're dead or whatever. And I got on there, and this guy got on from Dallas. And I said, can you call my mother? She lives in West Texas. He said, fine, sure. I gave him the information. And my mom gets this call from a stranger in Dallas. Your son's alive. And she said, I didn't know he was in danger. She had never heard of the earthquake, but and I relayed a lot of messages to people in the Bay Area because I had a phone and I was able to, get messages to the few people who did have phone service. But it was an amazing thing to see that kind of community just crop up.
Yeah, and I can add that there was a lot of activity on the well. I know Stuart Brand was reporting on the well about what he was seeing as he just he was out actively doing stuff. There were a lot of people who got out and they were doing whatever they could to help wherever they could, and then they would report back on a system like the well or on a system like Genie. And those kinds of systems are really valuable for disaster response.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because the public face of Genie is all about gaming. They ran a lot of ads that showed their game products, and I'm sure people like to play games too. But it's the same for almost all of these systems. When you actually talk to people who use them, they don't remember like, oh, they had the best like dungeon crawler game. They will remember like something like this. That is an interaction with other people.
And then the interesting thing that happened was social media. And before we run out of time, I just want to make an observation and kind of see what you think of it, which is the reality that I was seeing, kind of the way I saw what happened was that, we sort of followed these various social sites that happened. A lot of them were social networking sites where you could network with people, you could find people that and so forth. So you had, the first one was called 6 Degrees in the 90s, and that went away in 2000. But then there was one called Rise, RYZE, which was, it was inspired by the kind of business networking things that people would go to all the time. So this guy built a thing to simulate that online. And it was the first place I recall going where people started posting pictures of themselves. And then after that, there was like Friendster, and there was Orkut, and eventually there was Facebook. And adoption was kind of increasing as more of these things came along. And eventually it was obvious that mindshare was moving to social like systems, platforms on the internet. And the word social media, I think the coining of the word social media came from marketing people. And I think that it was like, oh my God, we can't use traditional media as effectively as before because people are moving away from that and they're starting to do this other kind of thing. And how are we going to think about it? And part of that was them calling it, they would call it social media, or they would just call it social. And it became about how can we make marketing work on media that's got a lot of user generated content that's social media. And I think that's part of what kind of corrupts, that may be a loaded term, but it diminishes the social part of it, and it brings in all this other stuff. And it also leads to things like Instagram influencers kind of things, where people are mostly just trying to present themselves online in a way that creates opportunities and advantages.
Yeah, those are really interesting observations. In internet research circles, people were using the term social networking sites, and there was like a agreed upon definition of that, which was mostly the 6 degrees kind of thing. Like you have a profile and you have connections to other people, whether they're friends or links or something else. So there is a turn toward what I think of as like feed-based systems, whether that's like, just the news feed on Facebook or this kind of infinite scrolling on Instagram recommendation page. And so it almost seems like the feed part is the more salient piece of the architecture from the profiles and the connections side.
Absolutely.
In some ways, like TikTok carries on the feed, even though it doesn't have like a vertical scrolling thing, but TikTok is all about the feed, like the next clip coming to you, versus you don't even necessarily go to the profile pages of the people who make the clips. You just go through the clips as they come. So it is interesting the way you put it, that it's like social became a category for marketers that was fit on a spreadsheet. Like, what's our spend on television? What's our spend on print? What's our spend on social? Just like you needed a way to do apples to apples comparison or something. And so then it made me think about like the place of advertising in some of these other systems. And in my previous work on Minitel in France, people really did not want ads to come over Minitel because they were paying per minute. So you can only download so many bytes per minute. You don't want those bytes to be ads unless you're not paying for them. That seems like, I haven't seen as much evidence about that, but that seems like generally true across all of these systems where you're not getting an all-you-can-eat package. You don't want to spend money to download ads. There's another researcher, Finn Brunton, who has an awesome book called Spam, The Shadow History of the Internet. And it's like a history of the internet through spam, like what is spam at different times. And he talked a lot about people getting so mad about unsolicited messages or duplicate messages coming over the network because they're paying for it. So once internet moves to like all you can eat, then ads, like the floodgates are open on ads, but nobody knows how much they're worth. So that seems to be the other like X factor on the last 10 years of ad technology, is that people kind of figured out that like banner ads weren't working, because there was some like eye tracking research that showed people didn't even see them. Like they had zero recall of exposure to banner ads.
Yeah,
So
that's the reason for the .com bust was because advertisers started realizing that they were paying too much for internet advertising. I mean that they weren't. I think part of it was that they had the idea that hits were the same as like impressions.
Oh
you
yeah.
know, so you launch a page and you get a lot of hits because, everything that loads is a hit. So, I got so many hits on that page. But, it's really just a fraction of that if you start thinking in terms of impressions or, users seeing. Then, you start thinking, are they really engaging with it in any way? And what happened was that, well, this was my understanding. I wasn't completely in the middle of this. I was working at a place where it was relevant, but apparently the people who were buying advertising on those early internet sites backed off in a big way, and things started collapsing.
Yeah. And the social networking paradigm, like social media platforms, they have a different promise they can make to advertisers, which is like, we know a lot about these people's interests because we ask them to tell us what they like. So we can make these like super narrowly targeted profiles, and we'll sell you ads against only people who are likely to be interested in your thing. That's like the pitch.
Yeah, if
which
you've
we
ever
can
set
see
up a
how that's like
Facebook ad.
weaponized in political contexts.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we know that well, like how effective these are. And so I always feel like there's kind of a race that this is, in some ways like the foundation is made of sand, because it's based on this assumption that this kind of advertising is actually worth what is being charged for it. And so the bottom could fall out. And that's the influencer thing seems like the total horizon of that, where now the ad is completely merged with the person that you think you're communicating with. So there's no sense that it's even like we're taking an ad break on this podcast. It's just like the whole thing is like advertorial, and we don't really know, like the distinction between the editorial and advertising side is like completely gone.
Yeah, if you've watched any TV lately, you'll notice that the new Jurassic Park movie is being co-sponsors of all sorts of products. They're little tie-ins where the movie has been mixed into the commercial, and that seems to be widespread now. It's not just a commercial for the movie or a commercial for whatever the other product is. They're just morphed together.
Here's the way that I'm been thinking about this. I want to hear what you all think about this, but it's like, if one model is there's a kind of a paywall and you pay an amount to get in, but then when you're in, there's no more ads and there isn't the incentive to data mine you goes down and to do that kind of like total surveillance. So if you have like a subscription model or some kind of pay-per-view model, that goes away. But then a lot of the good things that came from social media came from the free to play side of it. There's no barrier to entry. So a lot of the kind of progressive politics and movement building, and I guess we could say some of it is reactionary movement building too, but some of the, like a lot of the activity and energy that's happened around social media happened because people could get on for nothing. Like they could get on at the free Wi-Fi hotspot using their cheapo smartphone and participate and like have something to say and be able to send images to each other and things like that. So I'm kind of like, I don't want to give away that low barrier to entry, but so I'm trying to think about how do we move past this model that's based on like total saturation of low value advertising and data mining, like constantly tracking the activity of all the people there while still having the accessibility part.
It's a capitalist problem.
I guess so.
And capitalism
We're not
for some
solving it
people is
right
a
now.
problem, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, and we've run out of time. Actually, we ran out of time a few minutes ago, but we just kept going.
I know.
And it's a great conversation. So this means we need to have you back in a while.
Oh man, yeah.
If you'd like to.
I mean, I'm really enjoying the conversation here and elsewhere. So I'm happy to keep
so
it
much
going.
fun.
Yeah, we can talk about spam and
yeah, you should get Finn on here. He would be really great to chat with about some of these things. I'll send you a link to his book too.
Yeah, do that, and maybe you can get us an intro or something.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to mention that Kevin will be talking at length or posting at length about his book with other people on the Well. And that will be world readable, even though the Well is pay to play, but we have a section where people can read the conversations called Inkwell. So we're going to jump into the Inkwell starting next week and talk for a couple of weeks about the Modem World. So that's coming up, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thank you both for having me on. It's really fun.
you can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lubkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.